Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for Evil Raptors games. Right here we have Pumpkin Jack, and this is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But for the movement, we have a 25% axial deadzone, and this creates a central square of unregistered movement. So the diagonals are a little larger as a result. But because it's axial, this applies across the entire axis. So this creates a region of unregistered diagonal movement. So if you're anywhere in these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of four directions. So this is perfectly up, perfectly down, perfectly to the right, and perfectly to the left. You only start seeing diagonal movement when you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And this is most easily seen right around the dead zone where the angles are the most dramatic. Just trace the dead zone. You can see where the diagonal movement is. The shaded region represents the run threshold. There are two movement speeds available. So here's the kind of normal jog speed and then the run threshold. And this is a square shape. So this is a square dead zone or square threshold sitting on top of an axial dead zone. And this takes up the majority of the active stick region. For the camera, we have a 20% axial dead zone. So a little smaller, but functionally exactly the same implementation as the movement. And the same restriction here applies. So I can move the stick right around this vertical axis, and I'm moving perfectly horizontally. And you only start seeing diagonal movement once I break out of both axis dead zones. And this is most clear when moving around this horizontal axis and capping the view like this and looking for horizontal movement, which would be diagonal movement if it wasn't capped. The acceleration curve for the camera is linear, so it's just a smooth progression from the dead zone up to the maximum stick tilt. The vertical and the horizontal sensitivities appear to be the same. The diagonal sensitivity, if you were able to push the stick all the way to the corner, would actually be the same horizontal speed as moving right here, perfectly horizontally. And that implies, one, that the maximum diagonal speed is not capped. If you move perfectly diagonally, you should get about 70% horizontal movement compared to perfectly horizontal. But also that the curve is implemented per axis. That per axis implementation doesn't matter much when using a linear curve. That doesn't really affect the internal. So nothing too special here. The last dead zones are for the radial wheel. So switch the graph here. So the radial wheel grows over the course of the game as you get more weapons. So this is when you collect all 6 of them, and you have a central square where movement or the wheel begins registering. But once you fall back into it, it cancels out of the wheel and keeps your selection. And you can see these divisions are quite clear for these regions around the horizontal axis. However, the striped regions are, at least initially, dead zone. So you can see I can move here and it doesn't select any weapon. Oh, I did bleed over to the blue region. But you can see that I can move the stick here and nothing happens. But there is a quirk where if you push the stick fully, it does prioritize the right selection. And once you have a selection down, then it will carry through to the opposite side. So I have the shovel selected, and if well, there's actually a little quirk there that happens when you move right around it. But most often it carries through and you have to move across this range, which actually is an underlying 25% axial dead zone present here. However, when moving down, the same applies here, except it doesn't automatically pick a side when moving to the bottom. So this is just functionally dead space. And then when you select something, then it can carry over. This region, as well as the functionally larger kind of horizontal selections, are the result of an underlying axial dead zone. It's just increasing the range of these regions because they're included here, and it's specifically not choosing one in this case. This sort of dead zone, or at least temporary dead zone here, is strange, but it doesn't affect the even numbered radial wheels because you're going to be moving the stick diagonally anyway. But it does affect the odd numbered ones, so 3 and 5, because for those, the middle selection is right down. So if you want to select something there, you can push straight down and you won't actually select it. So that is an example of how axial dead zones can impact radial wheels, because they warp the range, and if you don't account for the zero value, you get regions potentially like this. But that about covers it for Pumpkin Jack. So moving on to the next one. Alright, so this is Akimbot, and this is also being demonstrated on the Series X. So starting with movement, we have a 40% axial dead zone this time, so significantly larger. And you can actually see here that the camera following begins before you even exit the dead zone. But we have a 40% central square. And since it's axial, this again restricts the diagonal movement within this dead zone. However, you do get sort of some diagonal movement thanks to the camera following. But you don't get formal diagonal movement until you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by these green regions. And in this game, you actually are limited to 16 directions. So we have the 4 cardinal directions represented by these blue regions. The more subtle diagonals are represented by these solid green blocks. And 45-degree angles are represented by this stripe threshold. And off the graph, there's another block, 45-degree movement. So I don't know why it was changed for this, but this is pretty noticeable when moving. You can see if I make a circle, see those ticks in movement pretty clearly. The movement speed, there's only one speed available. You're just always running at max speed past the dead zone. For the camera, we have a 32.5% axial dead zone. So there's that size of a central square. And the same restriction. So perfectly horizontal movement. And you don't see diagonal movement until you break out of both axis dead zones. And this is pretty abrupt. And for the reason for that is it seems that there's an underlying 25% axial dead zone, and then there's an additional 10% axial dead zone on top of this, but that the input is not scaled around. And we can see that very clearly with the curve. So the curve is linear, however, it's scaled to a 25% dead zone, and this extra 10% dead zone is cutting into that. So you start at 10% of your total speed, and then it builds up smoothly to the edge of stick movement. But because that unscaled axial dead zone applies across the entirety of the axis ranges, it also crops your subtle diagonal movement, so that occurs more abruptly than otherwise. The vertical and horizontal sensitivities appear to be the same. And similar to Pumpkin Jack, if your stick was able to move fully diagonally, you'd be able to move horizontally just as fast as you could moving perfectly horizontally with a stick. That again implies that the curve implementation is still per axis, which since it's still linear, doesn't affect the curve directly, but does show that the maximum magnitude is not clamped, and that's likely set up per axis. This has some pretty significant effects on your accuracy. So we have a very large dead zone, and your precise adjustment movements are actually just cropped. So making small adjustments, making diagonal adjustments is heavily limited, and there is some very generous aim assist offered, but this is something that's can pretty heavily impact playing without it. There are also dead zones for the Buggy for the steering, and that appears to be 25% axial dead zone. At least when you're stationary, it seems that your entire steering range is limited to about 1%. However, when you're moving at full speed, it increases to about 10%. That's still a pretty tight range, and it can be very easy to overshoot it. You don't need a whole lot of precision in this game, but it can feel like you don't have much granular control when in the Buggy. It feels more like you're just making regular full corrections rather than subtle movements. For the ship and the tank, they have both 25% axial dead zones as well, but they can move on both axes, and that has the same restriction as elsewhere. I think in general, this Akimbot controls quite a bit worse than Pumpkin Jack did. You have larger dead zones, more angular restriction, less angles just in general. Pumpkin Jack did give you granular control when you were in the diagonal regions, and the camera is significantly worse for the same reasons, but you need a bit more precision because this is a shooter. So this doesn't control quite as well, but that about covers this game. So on to the next. Alright, so we're here in Far Far West. This is the demo version on Steam. So, and this is being demonstrated with an Xbox controller. I had tried a PlayStation controller, but that didn't seem to register, or a PS4 controller specifically. It could be that maybe only DualSense controllers are supported, but that could be important because some PC titles have different controls between the input methods, but I'll be demonstrating this with an Xbox controller. But what we have here is a 20% axial dead zone for both movement and the camera. So we have this central square, and the same restriction, just 20% around each axis. So perfectly forward and back, perfectly to the right, and perfectly to the left. And you only start seeing diagonal movement occur, break into these green regions. That's a little more difficult to see with movement, but it'll be quite clear with the camera. The movement speed here, the movement curve specifically, is linear. So we have a smooth gradient from your slowest speeds up to your fastest ones. So this is the most granularity of any of their games so far. For the camera, it's exactly the same. So we have this central square, and the same restriction. So if I bob around the vertical axis, I'm moving perfectly horizontally, and you don't start seeing diagonal movement until you break out of both axis dead zones. And again, this is most easily seen looking straight up or down and looking for horizontal movement. This shows that threshold quite clearly. The acceleration curve is also linear, so just a nice smooth transition from slow speeds up to full stick tilt. The horizontal and the vertical sensitivities appear to be the same, and similar to the other titles, if your stick was able to move to the full corner, you'd be able to move at the same speed you would horizontally right here. So functionally that would be the diagonal speed could be up to 40% faster than the cardinal directions, and this implies that, like the others, that the curve is being applied per axis and not, and the extra magnitudes beyond 100% aren't clamped. The mount has the same dead zone, see here. But what's sort of interesting about this is that the mount sort of has tank controls. So within a forward direction, even a little beyond the axial dead zone, you follow the camera, and there's an option that just is independent of the camera. However, in either case, once you move horizontally enough, it is functionally more like tank controls, where you just move relative to the camera, or I mean relative to the character. And if you move backwards, you can see that it's all relative to the character. Now you can just, move around by steering the camera, but I think it would be nice to have a more traditional option where the character simply moves in the direction you have the stick pointed, so that you could, move diagonally or strafe around with this. Maybe there's a design reason for this, but this isn't a huge issue because you can just steer with the camera. But anyway, that about covers it for Far Far West. However, since this is a demo and in active development, hopefully they're receptive to feedback and some of the requests I have. The first is changing from axial dead zones to radial ones. That would allow you to exit the dead zone with the same magnitude at any direction, Currently, you have to move further diagonally before you start seeing any movement, and should remove these regions of restricted diagonal movement so that you'd have both the character and the camera would move in the correct direction you point the stick. For options, I think it'd be nice to have dead zone and curve options added. Being able to use smaller dead zones can greatly improve the accuracy of players by just making it easier to start seeing movement earlier. Having control over the acceleration curve, for example with a power function, and using a higher degree curve would dedicate more of the stick to slower values, so players who might find linear a little too sensitive can much more easily make small movements. I would have to be request that I've mentioned throughout all three of these games that the curve has been applied per axis, and it would be very important for a curve to be applied per magnitude from the center if any nonlinear curve was used, because if you apply a curve non-linearly or per axis, nonlinear curve per axis, it usually has issues with making the general diagonal sensitivity, with altering the diagonal sensitivity. If the curve is slower, then it's going to slow it down. If it's faster, it's going to speed it up. And it will also affect your diagonal movement. It'll make that incorrect. So setting up per magnitude would avoid that. And it would also be important to, since I've mentioned that the magnitudes beyond 100% aren't clamped, they should be, so that when you set up an exponential curve per magnitude, you can get much faster diagonal sensitivities beyond 100%, and clamping it would avoid that. There is some extremely generous aim assist in this game. However, by improving the controls, players who don't want to use aim assist could do so very easily just by giving them more control with an improved implementation and some additional options. The options we have, of course, we have sensitivity, but the aim down sights multiplier is correct as is, so these are already nice options to have, but having switching from axial dead zones to radial ones and adding a dead zone and curve slider would really idealize the controls. But and the last thing would be, at least for in the saloon, there doesn't seem to be implemented here yet, but there is emotes available, and they don't seem to work well on a controller. It seems like you have to use a mouse or use the left stick to select them. But like we've seen with Pumpkin Jack, where the axial dead zones could warp the radial selection ranges, switching to a radial dead zone would make whatever emote wheel more consistent, have correct divisions. But that's enough rambling from me. So those are all of Evil Raptor's games, and hopefully Far Far West can make some of these improvements and play the best it can. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.